Hello, Dr. James Bogash, expert in health and longevity, and today we're going to talk about a study published in New England Journal of Medicine. It was a large database looking at almost 900,000 kids, of which 193,000 had COVID. And there's some interesting things when you look at the data, and that's one of the important parts about not just reading the title. Because when you start looking at the data, there's some things that show up that are quite concerning, and it has to do with the difference between people who had recovered from COVID and people who got vaccinated, and what happened after they were vaccinated. And this is all kids, so from 5 to 11. Out of that group of 193,000, 309 were hospitalized, a very small number, and 7 were deaths, which it's all, like, I have to reiterate that any child dying is never a good thing, but the reality is that this is life and things happen. But a small database as far as the amount of kids who were hospitalized. But one of the things they found was that out of the large group of almost 900,000, 273,000 got at least one dose of the Pfizer, the mRNA vaccination. And what they found is that vaccine efficacy, which we all know now is how it's like jumped up pretty quickly and tanked rapidly. By about 6 months, about 2 to 3 months, it started to tank. By 6 months, we're back into the same thing that we've seen again and again, that we have a negative vaccine efficacy. So after 6 months, these kids were more likely to be diagnosed with COVID. Whether or not, like, we keep wanting to say, well, it's just behaviors that these kids are because they were vaccinated, they're now wild, running free, not wearing masks. But the reality is we've seen this very consistently, this whole negative vaccine efficacy. But even that is not the most important factor. What they found was that in the kids that were vaccinated and who were previously infected, and compared it to people who were vaccinated or kids who were vaccinated before and after they caught COVID, and there really wasn't much of a difference in the protection in the people who had the vaccination, whether or not they got COVID before or after. Which, okay, that's fine. But then when we look at when we compared the kids who were infected and got vaccinated versus the naive, so people who never had, who had COVID, there was a pretty strong protection. So ultimately, the protection quickly after, so we're comparing kids who got COVID versus kids who got vaccinated and then later got COVID again. And so what we found is that people that had COVID, the protection was very high, almost 100% very quickly. A year and a half later, it was still at 50% efficacy against future infection. So just alone, we saw a very different pattern that existed with the kids who weren't vaccinated than the kids who were vaccinated and were previously infected. So somewhere along the lines, this particular form of vaccination is affecting the immune response and shortening it, so that whether or not they were infected, these kids didn't notice a difference if they were vaccinated. If they weren't vaccinated, we had pretty good protection for a long time. If they were vaccinated, there was no difference in whether or not these kids got infected. Even more importantly is against hospitalizations. Again, we've got a small number, but ultimately, the kids who had COVID, their protection against against hospitalization was far, far greater than we saw far greater and far longer. So if you kind of look at you have to look at the timelines. It just is very clear that kids who had COVID, which is a very high number now, that vaccination didn't make a difference, and there's even every suggestion that it might be making things worse. These aren't things that we wanted to actually find out, but now that we have some data, which it takes time to gather data, it's not really coming out very stellar. And I do believe that in the long run, we're gonna figure out that the mRNA vaccination was a lost cause and will slowly go away. It's just my opinion, but everything is heading in that direction. As always, I'll post a link to this particular study in the description. Make sure you like this video, share it with somebody who you think needs the information, and subscribe to the channel.